the first portion of our service.
Good evening. We're gathered here, as we have been over the years, for our usual Yom HaShoah Remembrance service. But of course, this year nothing is usual. The fact that we are individually looking at our screens, not sitting together in the synagogue. The fact that we have to be restricted. All of these things make this a service like none that any of us has experienced. And it seems to me that the experiences we've had in the past weeks, when we have been isolated from each other, when we've been restricted in ways we've never been restricted before, give us an opportunity to begin in a small way to understand what those who were in the Shoah, who were involved, and particularly the survivors who are with us, what they had to endure. We are concerned because it has been 6 weeks or so since all kinds of usual activities have gone on. Can we begin to understand what it was like for a year, 2 years, 3 years, never knowing what the next minute was going to bring? And that is what our survivors went through. And so I think it gives us an opportunity to appreciate even more the fact that we have with us these people who had strong enough character to be able to get through the terror of the Shoah and to be with us, to start a new life, to create families, to create businesses, and to join Temple Israel. And so with great respect, with heightened respect, regretting that we cannot welcome these people in person, it is my honor to pay tribute and to recognize the survivors among us. Bill Bly, Lottie Bly, Eva Eben, Vera Eden, Fred Einstein, Mark Fingerhut, Cecile Brewer, Manfred Corman, Edith Weinberger, Eva Yarrett. And this year, we have chosen to solicit from our members the names of family members who did not survive, but whom we wish to recall in love at this time. Ludwig Oppenheimer, the Reichman family, Eugene, Vilma, Mendel, Sarah, Yosef, David, and Magda, Anna Rosenson, Ginny Glotzer, Anne Rabinowitz, Rose Werfel, Esther Scheiko and her husband, Suzanne Scheiko, Chaya Mendel-Mai, her husband and 2 sons, Luba and Madeleine Rubenlicht, Simone, Leo, and Madeline Anker, Kaftal family, aunt, uncle, and cousins, Blanda and Isaac Human, Ernst and Erna Einstein, Max and Tilly Guggenheimer, Hans Ludwig Englander, Elizabeth Englander, Paul Englander, Hedwig Englander, Lena Heilbrunner Steinfeld, Hugo Steinfeld, Hadassah Lewitt Green, Robert Lewitt, Nomi Rabinowitz Lewitt, Isaac Lewitt, Ruth Keller, Miriam Rabinovich, Stefan Leon Lewitt, Rosa Corman, Max Corman, Oswald Laufer, Simon Laufer, Necha Laufer, Gedalio Vino, Moshe and Zisla Vino, Israel Vino, Avram Vino, Yosel Vino, Noach Vino, and over 100 family members of Mark Fingerhunt. Yehi Zichrom Baruch. May their memories ever be blessed and inspire us to nobler living. Amen.
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 Yishar Koach, Rabbi Chari. We're now going to hear some words of welcome from our president, Bert Weston.
Good evening. And welcome really to probably one of the more important events we share each year, the remembrance of the Shoah, where we recount the stories, the experiences, and the memories of our survivors. I dare say as the years go on, the numbers of survivors diminish and the timeline since this horrific a period occurred and it extends, it becomes more important to mark the event, share the history, the remembrances, and the power of our people's instincts to survive, so that in fact we do never forget. Tonight's story will be presented by Mireille Taub, continues this important tradition and storyline, and I thank her in advance. And indeed, there are plenty of thanks to go around. To Lori Oppenheimer and the members of the Shoah Remembrance Committee, thank you for your efforts, for putting tonight's program together, and frankly, for your creativity in doing it in this ubiquitous virtual world in which we're living today. Thank you to the clergy, all who participate tonight to ensure that the memories continue to be heard and are never forgotten.
Thank you very much. I have a candle in my hand. It looks like a Shabbat candle. In a second, you'll be able to see of the Yom HaShoah yellow candles. Most years, the men's club helps everyone get a candle to light. However, if you have an ordinary yahrzeit candle or even a Shabbat candle, after this service is over, you are encouraged to light a light. Light is something that you can see but cannot touch, and it's something that endures. And so it has always been the symbol of how everything endures, life endures, memory endures, and how even after the darkness of the Shoah, we'll now do the evening service. You have the prayer book. We'll rise on page 281 for the Baruch Hu. 281, if you have a prayer book.
והוא רחום יכפר עוונו להשחית, וירבה להשיב אפו ולא יאיר כל חמתו. אדוני הושיע המלך יעננו ביום קוראנו. ברכו את אדוני המבורך.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Va'ed.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד.
You may be seated.
ברוך אתה אדוני בכל המשום ברוך ואבים ברומם. אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני המעריב הרבים.
Amen.
אהבת עולם בית ישראל המחבת תורה ומצוות. ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל.
Amen.
שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני
behalf.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך. וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. איך היה אם שמעתי ממני? ישמעו לכם ממפני לכם וזאת דעות המשתות. ושמתם את דבר אליי בכם.
Amantis, Kubrisis,
למען יראו עיניכם ומנעי בניכם על מה שנשבע. ולא דתו אחרי לבבכם ואחר עיניכם אשר עד בדרכם תזכרו ועשיתם כוס. אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. ואמונה כזו ביקם עלינו, כי אדוני אלוהינו ונועתו ואנחנו שמים.
אבל שכנו אבמות אבינו ויהרם קרנינו על כל שונאינו. המכה בעברתו כל בוחרים.
ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ובני ישראל הכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני מי כמוך נהדר בקודש נורא תהילות אוסף אל
מלכותך ראובניך.
מלכותך ראובניך בו קיים לפני משה זה הגיענו ואמרו אדוני מלוך לעולם
ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו.
ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. אשרינו אדוני אלוהינו שלום ולמען.
יסר מעלינו אוהב טרף וחרב ורב.
Shelter us in the shadow of your wings, O God, who watches over us and delivers us, our gracious and merciful ruler.
ושמור את צאתנו בין אליכם שלום יתה ועד עולם ברוך אתה אדוני שומר עמו ישראל
We rise on page 285.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה.
אמן.
בהלמד ואחותו והמליך באחותו בחיי חול ובימי חול ובחיי לכל בית ישראל. בעגלה בזמן קריב ימרו אמן.
אמן. יהי שמי רבי וברך לעולם עולמי עלמיה.
יהי שמי רבה וברך לעולם עולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל. שמי לקודשה
בריחו.
לילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה וימרו אמן.
We pray privately the Amidah 286A or B to 291.
עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ולכל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
294.
יגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה,
Amen.
העלמה דברך רותי והמליך מלכותי בחייך ובימיכון ובחי לכל בית ישראל, והגלה בזמן קריב, אמרו אמן.
Amen. Yehesh merach yolam amaya.
שמי רבם ברך לעולם ולעלמי עלמיה יתברך, וישתבח ויתפר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי לקודשם בריחו. לילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמיה במה ואמרו אמן.
Amen.
יתקבע צלותו נבואות לכל ישראל, כל אבו וישמעיה ואמרו אמן.
Amen.
יהי שלמר רבה משמע בחיים, עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
Amen.
עושה שלום ממרומיו הוא יעשה שלום, עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
Amen. You may be seated. Chazan Feeder is going to sing a song appropriate for the evening.
Good evening, everybody. So again, one of the differences between usual every year and this year, that we can't have a choir. Zoom hasn't yet made it to have everybody sing at the same time as we already experienced in our tefillot. So I chose to sing now a song called Es Brennt. It's burning. And it's a song written by Mordechai Gebirtik, who perished in the Shoah in 1942. He wrote it in 1938, actually, as a reaction to a pogrom that happened in his town. And then it was unfortunate kind of prophecy of what's going to happen later on. So it's our town is burning as Brent. Es brennt, Brüderloch, es brennt. Oi, unser Olem steht und Nebech brennt. Meise Wind mit ihr Gosen, reiten, brechen und zerblosen. Starker noch die wilde Flammen, als schon brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt an sich mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt an sich, unser Städtel brennt.
Okay.
Es brennt, Brüderloch, es
Let's try to
brennt.
do this meeting.
Oi, unser Orem steht, der Nebech brennt. So ben schon die Feierzungen, das ganze Städtelein geschlungen, und die böse Winden huschen, und der Städter brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt an sich mit verlegter Hand. Und ich steht und guckt an sich, unser Städter brennt.
Shakach. The generalized view of World War II France is that it was the place of Nazi collaboration. The leadership in Vichy was neutral only in name, doing what it needed to keep the Germans happy and at bay. There were unfortunately many collaborators who turned in, or even themselves, killed their Jewish neighbors and compatriots. Yet we must also remember that hundreds, if not thousands, of helpers risked their livelihoods and their own lives and the lives of their families to help Jews. We are privileged this evening to have Mireille Taub with us. Mireille is going to share the stories of how her family and her husband David's family escaped France with a mixture of foresight, luck, and the help of strangers. Mireille Taub has a professional diploma in special education and a master's degree in reading. Mireille and her husband David's families were friends from before the war. When Mireille and David married, they settled and raised their family in Freeport, where she still lives. Please direct your attention to your Zoom screens for a PowerPoint that'll be presented while Mireille speaks.
Good evening, everybody. I'm very honored to be here. We called our stories, mine, The Last Train from Paris, my husband's, The Kindness of Strangers, and as you hear me, I'm sure you'll understand why. I can't see what's on your screen, but on the first slide, where I have family album, I'll introduce you to my parents. There we go. And my dad was was born in Poland, but right near the Russian border, and actually lived part of his early childhood in Russia to escape the First World War. Subsequently, this saved his life in the Second World War, but I'll come back to that. Mom was from Warsaw. There we go. Mom was from Warsaw. She was a big city girl. And she and her family left Warsaw after the First World War because small business owners really could not make a living at that time. My mother's family were the costume makers for the Jewish National Theater, and my grandmother had a small leatherworks factory. My father came back to Poland after the First World War. His father had died when he was very young. His mother died when he was about 13. And he went to live in Warsaw with an older sister and realized no future there for him. Saved enough money to be able to get to France, country of immigration, and came in as an illegal immigrant, followed the crops as an itinerant farm worker, learned to speak French, but said farming life is not for him, and went back to Paris and entered the leather business, which had been the family business back in Poland. And he became a skilled pocketbook maker. He met my mother in France. They were married on New Year's Eve, 1931. My sister Raymonde was born in 1938. I was born, well, the picture is 1938. She was born in 1934. I was born in 1938. My parents loved French opera, so everything he could name was named after French opera. During the 30s, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, urged my father to contact his family in America because things certainly were not going to be good. And she said, I will contact my family, and whoever can help us with visas and papers and all of the documentation, we need to be able to leave France. And so Dad contacted his family. My grandmother contacted her American family. And in the summer of 1939, my extended family, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, everybody was on vacation when the war broke out. Everybody went back to Paris. My father wanted to join the French army, but was rejected because he was older and married and with children. But they said, wait, we may call you yet. Meanwhile, he prepared an escape route because the papers that we were hoping for did materialize. This is my dad's ID, French ID papers for foreigners. He never became a French citizen, was taken in profile. It's kind of anti-Semitic statement. This is my mother's ID, and her picture is full face, not only because she was quite beautiful, but she was becoming a French national. My sister and I were both declared to be French nationals by process of birth, but it was a separate declaration. So my mother, my sister, and I came in under the French visa quota, which was quite small. My dad, through very influential cousins in America, was able to get documentation as a stateless person because he had spent part of his childhood in Russia. He was one of 2,000 stateless refugees given a Nansen passport by the League of Nations. The first part of the war was a quiet war. It was called the phony war because there was very little military action. This from September through May, the soldiers probably just stayed where they were, not much advances. However, by the end of May and June, the war became quite hot. My father was called up and he brought his documentation to his commanding officer, who said, okay, get out of here, you have to leave. He was very understanding. And my father tells me we took the last train out of Paris before it surrendered about a week after we left Paris. We were on the train going towards Bordeaux. We needed to get out to Spain. The train was bombed and we walked to the nearest town. We were not allowed to come near Bordeaux. It was still a military site, and the French government had actually fled to Bordeaux, trying to decide what to do and how to handle the situation. We were in the small city of Menton, and my dad met the American consulate officer who had prepared our papers, and they both looked at each other, I suppose, and said, we need to get out of here. She needed to get across France to Marseille, where the American consulate was going to be established. We needed to get to Spain. So we walked, and eventually she hired a truck. I don't think is that better? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear, yes.
Anyway,
back.
I think I left off, we were traveling through Spain. We were not allowed to get off the train because Franco did not want refugees in Spain. We got into Portugal. My dad made arrangements for passage on a Greek freighter. Oh, by the way, these are the shoes that I wore when we walked across France. And we crossed in the part of a convoy. And 3 months later, we came to Brooklyn. And my dad decided not to go to Chicago, which had been the primary intent. And I was a very lucky little girl because I grew up a happy child in Brooklyn, always knowing that there were differences, but I survived, whereas my French cousins and my Polish cousins did not. May we go to the next slide, please? This is pictures taken in probably November, December of 1940. I am wearing the same hat that I wore in that picture that was taken in Paris before we left. My Aunt Bernice, my American auntie, my father, my mother, and my sister and I. And then my sister and I in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, probably the spring of 1941. Happy childhood, happy life. My husband's story is a little bit different. He had an unhappy childhood because of the circumstances. So we'll go to his slides, if you don't mind. He called his story The Kindness of Strangers. And the Star of David that you're looking at is actually my uncle's Star of David, who brought it with him when my father got him out of Casablanca in 1942. The word Jew was always written in the language of the country that was occupied. So Juif is Jew in France. And the next slide, I'll introduce you to my husband's family, David's parents. His mother came from the same small town that my father did. His father came from Warsaw. He was in the leather business, was a worker, could not find work, and we actually came to France because my dad invited him and said he could make a living in France. So they came to France in about 1929 with David's older brother, Jacques. Jacques was 10 years older than David, and David was born in 1932. In the middle picture, we have David's father, who always looked like a French undercover cop, saved his life. My mother-in-law, Annette, David's brother, Jacques, David, David's uncle who lived in America, and David's cousin, our cousin Suzanne, who lived in Warsaw, went back to Warsaw on the eve of the war and was killed by Polish peasants. David always told me he had the mum's photograph. And this is David in the other picture, just about the beginning of the war. He was about 8 years old. Can we go to the next slide? All right, David's parents lived in Paris between two railroad stations. Paris was declared to be an open city at the very beginning of the war, and so hoping that it would not be bombed. But there were some air raids and there were some bombs, and they were very concerned about David's safety, of course. And because David's mother had made friends among her clients, she owned a small pushcart between the two railroad stations and serviced many of the railroad workers. One of her clients suggested that David be sent to safety in the country. And he was sent to a little village in the middle of nowhere called La Guépie. This particular picture was taken just before he was sent. He's in the schoolyard with his friends. They're part of a scouting group. And David had told me that most of these students were not Jewish, but many of them did not come back after the war. In the next slide, this is where David was sent. As you can see, it was really quite far from Paris. It was a village that still looks like this today, 2,000 people perhaps. And David spent the initial part of the war there. His brother had served in the French Foreign Legion because he wasn't a French national. And when France signed the armistice, he asked to be released in the town that David was living in, stayed there for a month or two, and then realized by October they had not heard from their parents, who were in Paris under the Nazi occupation. And they went back to Paris. They're full of adventures, but not today. When they got back to Paris, Jacques was told to report to the police station, which was not unusual, check his identity, and he was promptly arrested and sent to a French concentration camp. There were many of them, about 150 miles from Paris, not too far from Orléans. Rumors began to circulate about the conditions in the camp that were equally challenging as the ones in Dachau. And my mother-in-law said to herself that she would not allow her son to stay there, and she was going to go rescue him. In the meanwhile, everybody living in Paris under the occupation, Jews were subject to the same Nuremberg laws. Area managers were appointed. My mother-in-law shut down the pushcart. Jews were not allowed to practice their professions. Jews had to surrender their bikes, their radios. They were not allowed to travel on public transportation. Life became increasingly difficult. There were curfews, food shortages. All the food was being sent to the German army. Jews were only allowed to shop at certain hours. It was, to say the least, very, very challenging. David's mother decided to help Jacques escape, and with the help of the people who knew, well, I'd like to go back. With the help of the people in her that she knew, they got her on the railroad to Orléans. She took a little donkey cart to this little village in which Bon-la-Rolande, where the camp was located, and she knocked on the door of a charcuterie appetizing store, and she told the woman inside that she wanted to sleep in the barn because she was hoping to get her son to escape. The woman said, absolutely not, but come inside, we'll talk about this. And when they went into the house, this woman invited her future son-in-law out. He was a French gendarme, of course, at the camp, and he helped arrange for the escape, and Jacques took a train back to Paris. David and his mother took the train back to Paris. They never saw each other. And towards morning of the next night, there was a knock at the door, and the French milice came in, and they said to my mother-in-law, "Your son escaped from the camp." And she said, "Thank you for telling me the good news." And they started to ransack the apartment looking for this over 6-foot person in the drawers, in the closet, under the bed, and began to pummel David, hoping that he might tell them something. My mother-in-law ran to the window and yelled out the window into the courtyard, "Stop beating up my son." And they said, "Okay, let's go look in the storehouse where you kept the stuff from your pushcart." And she went through the streets, and everybody said, "Madame Taub, are you going to open up the pushcart again?" And she said, "Not until ces messieurs, these gentlemen, leave." Jacques was hiding in several homes until the resistance could get him some false ID. As soon as he got the false ID, he was on his way out of Paris and was picked up in a dragnet. The commanding officer looked at the ID and realized that there were some critical mistakes in geography, realized that Jacques was probably Jewish, and told him to get the hell out of there. So Jacques escaped out of Paris to Toulon, and in Toulon he ended up joining the French armed resistance. And that's where he spent the rest of the war. David's parents are still in Paris, and now we're heading to 1942. And in June, July of 1942, there were rumors that there would be a mass arrest of the Jews in Paris. And David and his parents hid in the apartment that had been vacated by cousins of ours. And they hid for 2 weeks and were brought food by the same friends and neighbors who helped them all along. And they made arrangements for them to escape Paris and cross the line of demarcation between occupied and unoccupied France. They did that practically with the hounds of hell pursuing them. They were shot at, and eventually they were arrested for having crossed the border illegally. And they were sent to what is called a ghetto village. Can we have the next slide? The ghetto village was called Lacan-les-Bains, and periodically there would be arrests of the Jews who were living there. They had to register every morning, and once a week, once every 2 weeks, a bus would come. Jews were put on the bus, and they never came back. David's father was arrested and put on the bus, and because he looked like a cop, he happened to be the first one off the bus in the military base to where they were taken. He was saluted by the local gendarme. He did speak French with an accent, but he could say, "Bonjour, ça va, monsieur?" And he walked out after saluting them. He walked out into the streets of the town, walked up into the hills, and spent the next 2 years in the hills. And they never saw a Nazi soldier there the entire war. My mother-in-law stayed in this town, Lacan, doing odd jobs and trying to keep alive. But she realized how vulnerable David was in case she should be arrested. And so she contacted the family that had harbored him in the beginning of the war, and he was brought back there. And this time he was completely integrated within the society of the town. The priest had come to visit him and said, "David, you will come serve Mass. Help me." And David said, "I am not converting." He says, "I'm not asking you to convert. I'm going to save your life. You will assist me at the Mass. You will become a Catholic Boy Scout, and you will do the best you can to be an alive little boy." Many, many years later, we realized there were several Jewish children being held in the town. Nobody ever spoke about it. David thought he was the only one. So he was the head of Catholic Boy Scouts. He did odd jobs around town. And he was a lucky little boy because he had a hard life, but he was saved by these people. At the end of the war, this is the postage stamp that commemorates the liberation. David's parents came to get him in this town. This is David and his brother at the end of the war. And if it were not for the kindness of strangers, none of them would have survived. My aunt, my cousin and her husband, my aunt and her husband, and my cousin Madeleine, who was David's playmate, did not survive. My other aunts and uncles did not. And I brought my granddaughter to see the Shoah Memorial in Paris. We were shown a picture of a family, a mother, father, two teenagers. And they said, you know them? And I said, no, I was 2 years old when I left Paris. I just know stories. And then I looked at one of the young men in the picture and I said, oh my God, that's my mother's cousin Daniel. And it was, I realized afterwards. And my granddaughter said, Grandma Mimi, why are you crying? I said, when I think of the 1.6 million children that were killed and nobody is there to identify most of them, it could have happened to us. So we were the lucky ones.
Mireille, I want, on behalf of all of us, to thank you for sharing both of these stories. So profound and just told so beautifully, and really for opening up your heart to us by sharing these stories. I spoke just the other day at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, and you were there. And I said that there are basically two main reasons why we want to encourage people to share their stories. I spoke about validation, how important it is that we honor and respect people's stories. And I also spoke about the possibility of transformation. That is to say that in telling these stories, we might, one step at a time, help, as Elie Wiesel said at the dedication of the History Museum in Auschwitz, help the world to become a better world. So it's about validation and also about, ideally, transformation. But this evening, I just want to say more about validation. When people tell a story, it's tempting sometimes for us to try to make sense out of the story and to take it the next few steps and to say, oh, this is interesting, and this might mean this, and that might mean that. And that's natural, and that's human nature. But I just want to urge all of us, when we hear a story such as the one you shared, stories such as the one you shared, to just let it sink in, to just hear it, not just with our ears, but also with our hearts. Every day, we recite the words of the Torah in which God says, I want my words to be al levavecha, on your heart. And the great philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel said, why on your heart? He said that his teacher once said to him that when you hear something, you allow it to sit on your heart, and then gradually it enters your heart. You allow it first to sit, and then it enters. So I just want to thank you for sharing these stories. We say to you, Shamanu, we have heard them, and we will treasure them. We will allow them to slowly enter our hearts, and hopefully your stories and the many other stories that have unique elements and overlapping elements will continue to enter our hearts. And possibly as a result, these stories will encourage us, inspire us, together with you, to help make the changes in the world that the world so desperately needs. So that family like yours should never, ever have to worry about waking up in the morning and fearing for their lives and running for their lives. So thank you. Shamanu. We have heard, and we are grateful.
And I am honored.
I turn the spotlight over now to Chazan Frieder once again, who is going to share a very beautiful song, the words written by Hannah Senesh, who was a freedom fighter who lost her life defending our people. Eli, Eli, Shelo Yigamer Le'olam.
שלא ייגמר לעולם. החול והים, רשרוש של המים, ברק השמיים, תפילת האדם. החול והים, רשרוש של המים, ברק השמיים, תפילת האדם.
We're going to proceed now with our service and with the specific prayers of memorial. I invite everyone, as you are able, to stand for the counting of the Omer, the period in between Passover, the holiday of freedom, and Shavuot, the holiday of the giving of the Torah, which marks our responsibility. Page 55.
הנני מוכן ומזומן לקיים מצוות עשה של ספרת העומר, כמו שכתוב בתורה, וספרתם לכם ממחרת השבת ביום אביכם את עומר התנופה, 7 שבתות תמימות תהיינה, עד ממחרת השבת השביעית תספרו 50 יום. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו על ספירת העומר. היום 12 יום, שהם שבוע אחד ו5 ימים לעומר.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר קידשנו מצוותיו וציוונו על ספירת העומר. יום 19 יום, שהם שבוע אחד ו5 ימים לעומר. We continue with Aleinu on page 51.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא.
שהוא נותן שלנו. לכבוד שמך יקר יתנו ויקבלו כולם את מלכותך ותמלוך עליהם מהרה לעולם ועד.
כך כתוב בתורתך, אדוני מלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו
Chazan Frieder will now chant El Mole Rachamim, the memorial prayer in memory of the 6 million.
El male rachamim, shochel eine bameromim, hametzeh menucha nechona, tachat kanafei השכינה ממעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מה לנשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל שנטבחו בשואה, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם בגן עדן. תהא מנוחתם. אנא ברחמים, אז תרם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר
Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure to the souls of our brothers and sisters who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children of the house of Israel who were slaughtered, suffocated, and burned to ashes. May their memory endure and inspire deeds of tzedakah and goodness in our lives. May their souls in this way be bound up in the bonds of life. May they rest in peace. And together we say, Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to unmute everyone, and we're going to recite the Kaddish together on page 52. ויתקדש שמי רבא כעלמא דברה כדותי וימליך מלכותי
ויכון ויומתון חיי בכל בית ישראל ויהי בימרו אמן.
שמי
שמי רבם מברך לעולם עולמי עמיה. ישתבח יפאר ויתרומם
ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל
וישלח שמי בקדושה ברכתו כל ברכתו בשירתו ובנחמתו אמיר אמיר אמן. שלמה רבא מיכאל ישראל מלך יעקב
Shalom Birama,
Shalom Bimama, Shalom for Israel, Bimru, Amen.
Chazan Frieder is going to lead us in Shir HaPartizanim, in the song of the hymn of the partisans. And the words, I believe, will be displayed.
Sag nicht kein Molas, du gehst dem letzten Weg. Gott Himmel bleiene, verstellen bleiete. Kommen wird noch unser Reis gebänkte Schoch. Es wird abbeugt und unser Trott mir seine doch. Kommen wird noch unser Reis gebänkte Schoch. Es wird abbeugt und unser Trott mir seine doch. Von grünen Palmenland bis weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unserer Pein, mit unserer Weh. Und wo's gefallen sie, a Spritz von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird an unseren Gwure unser Blut. Und wo gefallen sie, der Spritz von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird aus unser Gwure unser Mut.
Our people, for centuries since our inception, have dealt with challenges, have dealt with discrimination and persecution. But one thing that we have never lost during these times of significant and bitter loss is our hope. And so it is fitting that we conclude our service with our people's song of hope that has been our soundtrack for so many years. I invite everyone to rise as we conclude our service with the singing of Hatikva.
Kol od badeva penima, nefesh Yehudi homiya, ulfatei bizrach kadima, hain lezion Sophia. Ot laven atikvateru, atikva bachnot alpayim, liot amechofshi be'aretzeinu, eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim. להיות המחופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים.
I'm going to just ask that we once again turn to that picture of the monument that's outside our synagogue. As we know, it's been our custom for many years to light candles and to proceed to that monument and to place it on this beautiful monument of remembrance. And God willing, next year we'll be able to continue that in person again. I want to thank everyone, the Shoah Committee under Lori's magnificent leadership, the Chazan Frieder, and Rabbi Schweber and Rabbi Chari and Mireille for sharing her story with us. To everyone, Yishar Kochachem, Chazak Uvaruch. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.